All right, so it's great to be back after hiatus. I wasn't sure about doing today's meeting because I just got in from New York this morning, but it's been so long since we did a Tanya class. I said, we'll go ahead, we'll do the class, and it's a very interesting topic today. So I'm gonna have to give a recap of what we've been discussing. We've been in chapter 8, and if you have, and you should have the Tanya book, the Practical Tanya. We're going to be on page, we're going to start on page 106. Sorry, 107. Actually, sorry, 108. We're going to be on page 108. Today we're going to hopefully get into meat and potatoes of a topic which hopefully you'd like to discuss. It's a very interesting thought. It's not the common way that we think, and so that's why it's going to be very important. As I've mentioned so many times, is that the Tanya is both important in the larger picture, and it's important in each chapter. There are important nuggets and gems and ideas that are very practical to our lives. And so as we've been going through this Tanya class slowly, I've kind of been giving you both the general outlook of where we're heading to, and then each chapter we discuss and we discover the specific meaning of what we can pick up from that specific chapter. So is there a book we're supposed to have? Yeah, there's a book called The Practical Tanya. You can find it in my YouTube video links. I put it on the bottom of each and every single one. You'll see the link to buy the book. So let me give you a general overview of the Tanya, of where we're up to, and then we'll get into today's discussion, which will be, we're going to continue and end off the discussion about the cleansing process for certain sins, or as one of our dear fellows over here wants to make sure we call it purgatory, which is indeed the word used in the translation of the Practical Tanya. And then we're going to get to a discussion about secular studies. Very interesting discussion on that as well. So what's the overview? Where have we been going? We started off the Tanya. The Tanya has a very basic question. It wants to know, are we righteous? Are we wicked? Am I good? Am I bad? What defines good? What defines bad? And the importance of that question wasn't as much as, well, what definition you're in, but it's actually a way to figure out what your mission in life is. Definitions, in general, help us interact with life, right? Without the proper definitions, that's kind of what goes on today in today's society. As definitions become harder to pin down, it's harder to have discussions. You need to have definitions in order to have a discussion about anything. And so if we want to define our life's purpose, we need to define what's good, what's bad, what can we do, what can't we do. So we had a bunch of questions. We put it off to the side. And then we said, let's take a deep dive into who we are, into our psyche. And so we started off discussing the godly soul and what the godly soul wants, and what the animal soul wants. So the godly soul obviously wants to do Torah, study Torah, do mitzvahs to connect to God. And the animalistic soul wants to be an animal. And if an animalistic soul is left to its devices, eventually it can do wicked things as well. And then we've been having a discussion the last 2 chapters, what happens when you do a negative deed, when you do a sin. And we discussed that despite your greatest intentions, if you do something negative, it will draw you down into a negative energy. And what does negative energy mean? What's the definition of negative energy? You're disconnected from God. So you eat something not kosher, even if you didn't know about it. Unfortunately, that food has the ability to an extent to disconnect you from God, and therefore you would need teshuvah, repentance. As we mentioned, all of these sacrifices in the temple were actually for inadvertent sins. You know, when you did something inadvertently, intentional sins, you couldn't even bring a sacrifice. So that shows us again that even when you do something inadvertently, you must there's a teshuvah process to cleanse yourself. We've been discussing that there are really 3 different different flavors of things in this world that we can interact with. There are things that are completely good, like a mitzvah. There are things that are completely bad, like sinning, like eating pork, right? There's no hope for it. And then there's a nice middle ground in life. There are items which are middle ground, And the middle ground items, that's where our intention matters, right? So if you're doing a mitzvah, some mitzvahs need intentions, but some mitzvahs, even if you don't have a mind, you're doing the mitzvah anyways, okay? Or even a minimal amount of intention works, okay? So again, it's good, okay? You give charity, even it says if a coin drops out of your pocket and a poor man picks it up, you get a mitzvah of giving charity, even if you didn't have in mind. Some mitzvahs require a minimal amount of intention. For example, if you hear the shofar on Rosh Hashanah, you have to have at least in mind you're fulfilling a mitzvah. And then some mitzvah, all right, so that's the positive things in life. There's the negative things in life, like eating pork. If you eat pork by mistake, no matter how much Torah study no matter how much Torah study you use that energy for, it's not going to help you. It's that energy is stuck in the negative. It's stuck in a negative energy disconnection from God. Then finally, we have the middle ground of life, and this is where our intentions matter. Middle ground of life means things that can go either way. So eating, when I'm eating something kosher, here it depends on my intention. Am I eating gluttonously, or am I eating with the intention to serve God? So those are the three flavors that we have, and this is important because again, we're discussing what's our godly soul and animal soul. What do they want? Well, the godly soul wants to connect to God. Therefore, the godly soul wants to stay away from the negative things, wants to do positive things, and wants to elevate the middle ground. Conversely, the animalistic soul is not so interested in the positive things. Maybe not against, but it's not interested if it doesn't really do anything good for it. It's very interested in the middle ground and being very gluttonously, and sometimes as well interested in doing negative sins as well. In this chapter, we started to discuss different punishments that happen, or I should say cleansing process that happens when you commit certain different sins. So we're going to take a look at some of those. And as I mentioned last week, the purpose of understanding the cleansing process helps us appreciate just how damaging these sins are to us. If we need such a cleansing process, that means, hey, it's probably a good idea to stay away from them. So that's why it's important for us to look at these sins. Again, I said Hasidic philosophy generally does not focus on the punishments. We don't usually use that as a form of inspiration, especially in today's day and age. Telling people, how they're going to go to hell for all the terrible things they did is not very effective. But we like to discuss the positive. However, understanding what happens when you do something negative makes us appreciate, how important it is to stay away from it, even if it's not our primary motivator. So, for example, I don't know, in diets, I don't know how much, you can sell someone on the bad effects of eating sugar, or you can sell someone on the good effects of eating healthy, right? Unless someone's getting really sick, mostly you have to be sold on a positive vision. It's very hard to sell someone on a negative vision, and that's staying away from something. Some people that talks to them, but for many people, we need to be sold on a positive vision. You're going to feel good. You're going to feel great. You're going to look good. You're going to have the energy to do what you want. Telling someone if you eat bad food, you're going to be stuck in bed all day, and sugar is going to drag you down. You're going to die at the age of 55. It doesn't talk to them that much. I mean, it helps, but so that's what we're going to do here. We're going to tell you what happens just so you appreciate at least how these things are negative. Not that this is the way we're going to inspire you to stay away from them, but you have to at least have that understanding that these are negative items for you. All right, so with that in mind, we're going to take a look again, page 108. Last week we discussed the purgatory, the cleansing process of detoxification for eating things with hedonistic pleasure. And then we started to discuss if you talk words, just chitter chatter for with no important intention. And now we're going to discuss over here what happens if you talk evil talk. So remember, there's talking things that are just wasteful is not in the sin section, but it's in the middle section. But within the middle section, I need to let some people in. But within the middle section, you have the opportunity for your intentions to pull it down. So again, talking itself is not necessarily bad. But if you talk with no purpose in it, then you're going to drag that down, and there was a purgatory for that. Now we're going to discuss what happens if you discuss forbidden things. So we're going to be over here in the third paragraph, page 108. So it says like this: but with forbidden discussions such as mockery and lashon hara, slander, okay, shehein mishalosh klipos l'tameas l'gamri, which are powered from the three completely impure klipos, kaf hakela alone is not sufficient to cleanse and detoxify the soul from its impurity. Rather, the soul must go down to Gehenna and purgatory. So let me explain what he's saying here. Kaf hakela, we explained last week, is like a washing machine for the soul. What does it mean? The soul, by virtue of being too involved in hedonistic and worldly pleasures, the soul, when it gets to heaven, needs to be able to let go of those. Therefore, there's a process by which it's, so to speak, put in, we call it a spiritual washing machine. So it wasn't necessarily a punishment, it was a detachment from the physicality of life. But what it's saying here is that if someone actually sins, they need to go down to a purgatory. So what is purgatory? What do people think of purgatory? What do you think it looks like? I'm opening this up to the crowd over here. What does purgatory look like?
It's not a place.
It's not a place?
I mean, it's not a physical place.
Not a physical place. Okay, good. All right. So what is it?
I mean, it's hard to find the words to describe it. I mean, it's
right. If it's not physical, it's hard to describe.
Yeah. I mean, it's the precursor to, the world to come. And I'm riffing here a little bit. When we pass away, we go through a heavenly court. The court assesses our lives, and if there's, when we've all sinned, we have to go through a cleansing, and that's what Gehenna is all about.
Right.
And it's more like one rabbi used to call it like a car wash. It's like it's like a spiritual car wash.
So that was one level of purgatory, the car wash. We discussed that. But I guess there's a car wash and then there's scrubbing, if you want to put it that way. If you just have dirt on you, that's one level of cleansing. Then there's if you get blemishes, right? If you get stains. So when we sin with permitted items, it's not deeply embedded in us, and so to speak, the car wash type of cleansing process works better. If you have the stains, and stains come from sinning with things that are completely forbidden, that's a lot harder to get out. And that's why it's a much more involved. So that's why we were discussing last week, kind of the washing machine of the soul. That can go if you've just, eaten gluttonously or done things, taken permitted things and doing them in a non-godly manner. But if you actually take a sin, that's a stain that attaches to you that requires a much deeper cleansing process. Okay? I mentioned last week that within the cleansing process, there are two different forms of hell or purgatory. Sorry, use the word purgatory. There was one that's called the purgatory of fire, and there's the purgatory of snow. So the purgatory of fire is the one that cleanses us for sins that are coming from our heated passion, and there is the purgatory of snow, which cleanses us of our sins that are caused by laziness. So is it full of actual snow? Is it full of actual fire? The answer is, of course, no. It's not physical fire, it's not physical snow. So 100%, it's hard for us to actually describe. The main thing for us to really know is that a cleansing process will be required, and that cleansing process is very painful. Our sages tell us that all the trials and tribulations of Job. Anybody here read the book of Job? It says all the trials and tribulations of Job for many years, right? He lost his house, he lost his money, he lost his kids, he lost his health. Everything that you could imagine happened to him. It says the 70 years of punishment that Job got is less painful than 1 hour in purgatory. So it's interesting. Why? Why is it like that? In other words, why is purgatory so painful? And again, my point here is I'm not trying to inspire you, I'm trying to scare you into doing the mitzvahs, but it's just an interesting discussion just to help us understand purgatory a little bit. My understanding is like this, is that punishments on this earth are much more effective. Cleansing on this earth is much more effective because we don't have the context. In other words, because we don't see the truth. And therefore, although technically it's not more painful, practically it feels more painful, right? Pain that we feel on this earth is magnified because we're not seeing the truth. And so, we get to all these questions, why do bad things happen to good people and all these different things? When you're in heaven and you already see the truth and you already see the goal, right? You're going to go through this cleansing process and you're going to get, the world to come. Then it requires a lot more, of a cleansing process because you're already there at the end. You already see the truth. You already see where you're supposed to be. So it's kind of harder. It's like repentance. Repentance is more accepted when you're still deeply involved in the issues, right? In other words, for example, someone who's very young and very enjoys food, and for example, someone who eats non-kosher their whole life, and then when they turn 90 and all they could eat is prunes and apple juice, and they say, all right, I'm going kosher, God, I'm going to do teshuvah, I'm going kosher. The teshuvah is somewhat effective, but it's not as effective as when you were still enjoyed a good steak and you still enjoyed a good piece of ham and bacon, right? You know what I mean? It's not the same. So the same thing is the soul in heaven. It's a little bit different. Someone wrote here, don't know why I can't read. Mucho gracias. Okay. Someone wrote here, so purgatory is not a place, it's a process. It's a process. Well, yes, it's a process. Is it a place? It's a spiritual place. How do you define place if it's not physical? It's a discussion for another time. In some ways, actually, they describe spiritual places as processes. In other words, where you are in your understanding and your what am I thinking of the word? I don't know, it slips my mind. Anyways, is purgatory different than Gehenna? Someone asks here. Is purgatory different than Gehenna? Gehenna is purgatory. Someone asks, why was he punished? Oh, Job, why was Job punished? That's a discussion when we discuss the book of Job. It's a good question, which I don't want to get into now. Very good question. Okay. So what we're gathering from here today is purgatory is a place which we're not going to understand very well. One thing we know for sure, it is not the purgatory that's described in other religions, which is a place of which you are utterly damned and which you are there forevermore because you weren't saved or whatever they want to say about it, or infidels, or Robert, you may have a better perspective on this.
No,
Yes.
Just to clarify, no, they in some of those other religions, there's a distinction between purgatory and hell. So purgatory, like in Catholicism, is the same idea as we have in Judaism, but then they have hell, which is the permanent place forever.
Got it. Okay, got it. So we only have purgatory, we don't have hell, except the Talmud actually discusses there are a couple people who are forevermore punished. if you're really, really, really wicked. But I mean, you've got to be really bad. You've got to be to the point where you have not only sinned, but you caused many, many, many other people to sin. So there are exceptions for some very, very wicked people. But generally, we only have purgatory. We don't have hell, as I guess they describe it. And purgatory, as I said, is a very painful process, but we have to understand that it's limited. It doesn't last more than 12 months. It says if you're wicked, you get 12 months. If you're not so wicked, you get 11 months. That is why the Kaddish is only said for 11 months. I also want to mention that there's a custom, a Jewish custom, that you don't visit the grave of your loved one for the first 12 months after they pass away, because we're told that they're busy. In other words, they're busy with the judgments. It's not a very fun time for them necessarily. We don't know, but we don't want to disturb them. There is a custom amongst many Jews that for the first 12 months, we don't visit somebody after they pass away, because it's a very busy time for the soul, very possibly painful time for the soul, and we don't want to, bother them at all during that period of time. But afterwards, we understand that they're in a very peaceful place, and it's all good. Okay, so getting back into the text, unless anybody has any more questions or comments, unmute yourself. Okay. So now he says like this. The same is true. So again, we said a moment ago, if you speak forbidden speech, you have to go to purgatory. The same is true for someone who is able to immerse himself in Torah study, but instead immerses himself in worthless discussion devoid of Torah content or purpose. In that case, Kapakela alone cannot help his soul to be cleansed and purified, since his activity has been sinful, i.e. from the 3 completely impure klipos. And to be cleansed, that soul needs specific severe punishments for the particular sin of neglecting the Torah. What this is saying is that a sin can be, sometimes you actually do a negative commandment, or you're not doing a positive commandment. So it's easier to understand, for example, tefillin, right? We're supposed to put on tefillin every day. If you don't put on tefillin one day, although technically you haven't done a sin, but yes, you've sinned because you have not done a positive commandment. Or let's say it's Passover, you don't eat the matzah. By the way, I just want everybody to know, as we'll see in a moment, I do these sins too, right? I don't always study when I have to. So don't think I'm here and like preaching to you fire and brimstone over here, okay? This is not the Tanya's general focus, but it's to help us appreciate and understand the power of each mitzvah. So, right, if I had the opportunity to eat matzah on the night of Passover and I decide not to eat matzah, I will. There's a punishment that will go along with it, because yes, I didn't do a negative commandment, but I avoided doing a positive commandment. So the same thing goes if I have an opportunity to study Torah, and I am not studying Torah, right? So I'm not in business. I'm not helping my kids take a bath. I have the time, and instead I am watching something on YouTube, just wasting my time. Okay, and again, and I assuming you have the mental capacity to study, right? Sometimes we need a break, but assuming again you have the mental capacity to study, you have the time to study, and you choose not to study, then you are neglecting a positive commandment. Okay, and he says here that there's a general punishments for avoiding positive commandments, and specifically avoiding Torah study, which is a very special mitzvah. There's an even, he says here, more severe punishment, but he doesn't specify, because again, it's not his purpose. So let's read it here. And that is besides the general punishment administered for the idle neglect of any positive commandment, which also applies in the case of neglecting Torah study. So again, Torah study, in addition to the regular punishments that apply to avoiding any mitzvah, there's a special punishment for avoiding Torah study, because studying Torah is such an important mitzvah to our lives. He doesn't specify here what it is, because again, it's not the Tanya's focus. And he says here, what is the punishment for avoiding positive commandments? That is the purgatory of snow, as is explained elsewhere. Again, snow is coldness. Coldness is laziness. In other words, right? Passion is when you do a sin. You are actually physically doing a sin. Cold is like when you're not moving. You're not doing anything. So you get the purgatory of snow. Is there snow there? Probably not. The question people have, though, is living in Florida, do you avoid possibly the purgatory of fire? If you live in Florida, can that count for some of our purgatory of fire? Okay, anyways, it says like this. A person usually transgresses a prohibition out of warmth, i.e. desire and lust, whereas neglecting a positive command is a symptom of coolness and indifference. Therefore, in the afterlife, prohibitions are cleansed by a hot Gehenna of fire, and the neglected commandments by the cool Gehenna of snow. If you're more interested in these topics, by the way, of the different type of hells, which personally I'm not so interested, it doesn't inspire me. So I don't really need to spend the time. I need to know in general that there is a punishment associated with it. But to me personally, I don't feel the need to study the details of the punishments because it's not going to inspire me to do more mitzvahs. That's me. If you find it inspirational, you can find many books of Musar, which will probably describe to you all the different punishments that will happen for all the different sins, and they get in detail and all the different things that are going to happen to you. If that works for you and you like it, go ahead and do it. But as you can see, Hasidic philosophy does not spend a lot of time on it. It's mentioned here in passing, and even then not in detail. But there are many other books which will go in very much detail into it. And if that's something that you enjoy, by all means, go ahead. So what I'm trying to say is I'm not trying to tell you not to do that. I understand everybody has different things that inspire them. If that inspires you, go ahead and look at it. But for me personally, it doesn't. So, and I really haven't studied in depth the different type of hells because it doesn't really inspire me. All right, so we're going to go to section 3, the secular wisdom. The secular wisdom says like this. This is where we're going to have a discussion that I was interested in having. So many of you are here and you understand and appreciate that Judaism is very good for us, and Torah study and mitzvos make us better people as well. And therefore, but many people have a feeling that there's nothing wrong with secular study. Just hand says Esmeralda, it's not physical. So as human beings, I don't want to say the word worship, but to an extent, almost the greatest thing in life someone can accomplish is intellectual, is in the intellectual realm, right? Some people are very strong. Some people, are great athletes. But at the top of the chain really are the smartest people, right? Intellect is kind of the greatest that the physical human being has. Because also in general, intellect is the greatest thing. That's what makes people special, right? Is our intellect, right? We have athletes, but there are, many animals that are very athletic as well. What makes human beings special is intellect. And therefore, most of the world, there's a very large focus on being well educated, and rightfully so. What makes human beings special is being well educated. And therefore, you might think that any type of education, so let's say, okay, obviously today, people get into discussion, well, the education is mixed with politics and pushing policy, want to get to objective, but let's put that aside. Let's say one could study secular wisdom. You can study any type of secular wisdom, any type of wisdom in the world, mathematics, science, geology, geometry, biology, all of these different studies. One might assume that all of these are very important studies and elevate a person, and therefore there's absolutely nothing wrong with them. They're completely, what could be wrong with them? What we're going to discuss today is that that's not necessarily correct. We have to understand intellect falls in the same 3 categories as everything else in this world. Just as food has 3 categories, mitzvah, forbidden, and middle ground. Similarly, any intellectual study and pursuit can be one of these 3 things. You can have mitzvah type of intellectual studies, for example, Torah study. You can have forbidden type of studies. We can understand, studying, for example, studying idolatry, Okay, if you're reading books of idolatry, it would be a forbidden type of wisdom. For example, there's other forbidden types of wisdom. And then there is everything else is the middle ground. That's really the idea. If something is not a mitzvah, we have to understand it's the middle ground. So all the study, mathematics, geometry, biology, math, all of these things are the middle ground. Just because it's great and it raises a person up, an intellectually better person does not make it holy and does not make it you connected to God. So going back to our food analogy, just as in food, there has to be some type of intent in the middle ground type of food that elevates it. Similarly, we'll see you, Tzipora. Similarly, the intellectual pursuits have to have a specific type of intent that will elevate it. Otherwise, just like food, if there's not a positive intent, automatically it's going to draw you down. So let's take a look here at the text. And again, this is controversial because we tend to think of intellectual study as a great and important thing, and many wonderful people spend a lot of their time studying intellectual study. And we have to understand that intellectual study alone without a godly purpose is actually problematic. So let's read it and then we'll discuss it. So it says here on page 109. Similarly, studying even permitted non-heretical forms of secular wisdom is considered a sinful neglect of Torah study, tantamount in Jewish law to worthless discussion. Wow. So he's saying you could be studying very deep geometry, and it's possible that you will be doing a sin of neglecting Torah study. In other words, the study itself is not sinful, right? It's not like studying idolatry, but it's a waste of your time. Let's develop this, okay? As stated in Rabbi Schneur Zalman's Laws of Torah Study, according to this ruling, if a person has a choice at any given moment, whether to study Torah or secular wisdom, and he chooses the latter, he is considered to have neglected the commandment to study Torah. So let's say, for example, you're sitting on your couch, and you can either pick up the book of Tanya, let's say, or you can read the latest journal of, I don't know, National Geographic, let's say, for example, okay? It's very possible that by picking up the National Geographic, even if there's nothing sinful in it, you are, in a sense, doing something wrong. And he's going to add another layer to this. We're gonna develop this idea. Again, not only is it sinful because you're wasting your time because you could have been studying Torah, he says like this. Also, from a Kabbalistic perspective, secular wisdom is more contaminating for the soul than worthless discussions. Since worthless discussions only influences and contaminates the emotional attributes of the divine soul, whereas secular wisdom contaminates the divine soul's intellectual attributes. That's a powerful line. What he's saying is that if, again, we'll define soon when secular study is considered sinful. But if you're doing secular study in a manner that is incorrect, then it's actually worse than many other forms of sin. So, for example, if you take kosher food and you eat gluttonously, all right, so you became a little bit more of a glutton. But if you take secular wisdom and you're dragging it down to a point where it's disconnecting you from God, it's much worse because it's connecting to your brain, and your brain is really what affects how you act. And so if what you're studying is changing the way you think, then that's going to be a problem. So if the intellectual study is not connecting you to God, it will eventually bring you down. And I've seen this, by the way, and again, I'll get to soon when it is allowed, but this is a very common thing where many Jews, religious Jews, go to college and they drop much of their religion. Well, why are they dropping their religion? Well, you may say, well, they became very educated and now they know, there's no God or something like that. No, it's not just that. It's not always that. It's if the study is not done with the proper intention, the worship of the intellectual study alone will draw a person down and affect their way of thinking. But We're going to hold off. We're going to discuss it a little bit more soon. But that's the idea. The point is that secular studies, if done improperly, can contaminate your mind. Let's continue. An impure faculty of the animal soul will only contaminate its corresponding faculty in the divine soul. Since empty words do not require any significant intellect on the part of the animal soul, they do not contaminate the divine soul's intellect. So then he continues in a more Kabbalistic way of discussing it. Worthless discussion contaminates only the emotional attribute of the divine soul that stems from its sacred element of wind, which become contaminated by klipas noga, and purity of worthless discussion from the negative side of the animal soul's element of air, as noted above. All right. It's not important. He's giving the Kabbalistic idea to it. Okay? He says, but worthless discussion will not contaminate the intellectual faculties of your wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and your divine soul. Because the worthless discussions are words of nonsense and ignorance, the proof of this being that even fools and uneducated can speak that way. Secular wisdom, however, page 110, does influence and contaminate the intellectual faculties of your wisdom, understanding, and knowledge of the divine soul with the impurity of klipas noga and these forms of wisdom. What is klipas noga? For those who remember, klipas noga is the impurity that attaches itself to middle ground items that are done with the wrong intentions. And he explains here, we are not speaking here of idolatrous or heretical wisdom, but of general knowledge that has no anti-religious content. You know, it's interesting. I remember I was listening to there was some conservative talk show host who was saying, oh yeah, the religious Jews had the right idea by not sending their kids to college, because now college teaches them all about the different political things I don't want them to know. That's not why religious Jews didn't send their kids to college. The reason religious kids didn't go to college, or at least not when they're younger, sometimes they go when they're older, is more because of this idea that we're going to discuss over here, is that secular study alone, without a purpose, just going to study college to become educated, is not desired. There has to be a purpose to it. We're going to discuss what are the purposes. Why should mathematics or medicine, for example, be contaminating for the soul? But I am not necessarily agreeing or disagreeing with the assertion that colleges teach other ideas. The point is, even if you have a completely objective college, which doesn't teach any politics, if there's such a thing, I don't think there is, but if there's an objective college that teaches completely intellectual ideas, devoid of any agendas, it's possible that it would contaminate your soul. So the Tanya is going to answer, how could mathematics or medicine be contaminating to your soul, right? So we have a doctor on here. He studied medicine, now it's contaminating his soul. So he explains like this. So first we have to understand the spiritual root source of wisdom. So he says like this. Basically, he's going to explain it. He explains it here in depth with a based on the Kabbalistic understanding. But the Kabbalistic understanding is basically like this. Now, once upon a time, there was a spiritual world which had vessels, and it had light. Vessels are containment, right? Vessels contain a light, right? Like you have a cup that can hold water. There was a spiritual light, and there were vessels that were supposed to contain that light, right? For example, if you don't have a cup for your water, you can't drink it, right? The cup allows that water to be used. The cup gives context to the water, places it in a mold, and allows you now to drink it. Otherwise, it spills on the floor. So the same thing is spiritual lights. Spiritual lights, in order for them to be useful, they need vessels. They need something to hold on to. So it says, once there was a spiritual world in which the vessels weren't big enough, and the light cracked it, kind of like, you're blowing up a balloon and poof, too much air, it blows up. And so it says that some of the light descended, the shattering, so to speak, caused fragments of this very holy light, this originally very holy light, to vest itself in this world, and to vest itself into not necessarily holy things that have the ability to give us a lot of ego. But we all know, by the way, that intellectual pursuits for many people can give them a lot of ego, right? Anything godly should be giving you complete nullification towards God. But secular studies can give you, as he says over here, right? He says, let's just get to the bottom. While sacred in origin, referring to secular studies, the falling of these shattered vessels gave rise to the klipos, since the vessel fragments contained an overwhelming mass of self-awareness and only a tiny glimmer of light, God awareness. Therefore, earthly secular knowledge, which is a product of shattered vessels of Chokhmah and Bina, has a propensity towards self and ego and tends to contaminate the mind away from God consciousness. This is true. Intellectual studies have a propensity to give people too much of feeling of themselves. What makes something godly is feeling God. So what's the antidote? Once we understand this, right? What's the issue with secular wisdom? Is that the revelation of God within is very hidden, right? When you study Torah, it's all about God. It's godly wisdom. You study secular studies, it's not about God. Therefore, it has the possibility to give you a big ego. Ego disconnects you from God, right? You have to let God in. So the antidote to this is to study secular studies in ways that connect you to God. How so? If they are serving God. So I'm going to skip. Well, he just says over here, the shattering vessels affected only the backs of the sacred Chokhmah Bina, as is known to those familiar with Kabbalistic wisdom. We're not discussing the Kabbalah. Let's skip over here. Secular knowledge will contaminate a person unless he uses it as a spade with which to dig, namely to earn a comfortable living so as to be able to worship God, or if he knows how to utilize secular wisdom in the service of God or his Torah study. In other words, like this. Just like food, if it's used for the correct purpose, if food is used for the correct purpose, it can, if food is used, I'll look at the time in a second. If food is used for the correct purpose, it can elevate you. What's the correct purpose? To serve God. Similarly, if you study secular study, but with an intention, either to make a living or to deepen and help your service of God, which it can, then it is okay. So again, just like anything else, intellect has a middle ground. If you can find a way that intellect is serving God, then it's not ego anymore, right? The whole issue with the middle ground is the ego that's in there. So for example, when you're eating, naturally it's ego. It's about you. It's about your food. It's about the wonderful taste. If you can eat with an intention to say, I'm going to eat in order to study, to pray, to work, to make a living, to support my family, to live a Torah life, then you've taken the ego out of the eating, or at least to an extent. Similarly, when we study even secular wisdom, if we can bring God into the picture, then it's not about our ego anymore. So if someone's studying mathematics, or let's say medicine, if it is, let's say, with an intention to earn a living, to heal people, so that they can be healthier and serve God, if it's to, or sometimes it's to better understand the Torah and the Torah wisdom, then that's okay. You have now brought God into the picture of your secular Torah study. So, for example, let's get to the example of you're sitting on the couch. You have in front of you, you have Tanya and you have a National Geographic. Is there a way that you can pick up the National Geographic and say that it is not about just your desire for more knowledge, but there's a godly pursuit in it? Any thoughts? Someone's asking if I'm conflating the word wisdom with knowledge. I'm not sure what the secular wisdom is. Need precisely rather than knowledge. I'm not sure exactly. Tanya has its own definitions for wisdom and knowledge. Tanya's uses the words wisdom, understanding, and knowledge, and they are the three processes of the intellectual understanding. So I put them all together, really. But here's the question. Is there a way that you can sit on your couch and pick up a National Geographic?
No.
There's never an instance?
No, not according to what you're talking about.
All right, let's back up. So number one is, let's say your brain is tired and you can't study Torah now. Okay, then everybody would agree it's okay, right? That's right. If there's nothing wrong in it, okay. But let's assume you have the mental capacity to study the Tanya, right? Okay, so again, if you can't study, different story. But if you have the mental capacity to study, is there a way that you can pick up the National Geographic and it would be allowed?
Yeah.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, just, like anything, if you need something to maybe recharge your batteries to be able to resume or start Torah studies or whatever.
Well,
I mean,
that was the first instance. I said a moment ago, I said, assuming you right now have the mental capacity to study, right? If you don't have the mental capacity to study, whatever, right? You do a neutral activity till you can. But let's say, assume right now you have the mental capacity to pick up the Tanya. Is there any excuse to pick up the National Geographic?
I would say no.
Well, I don't know. I don't know about that. I would say if there's something in the National Geographic relating to something that you're involved with or studying that could help make a new discovery or help something to help others, then I would say that could be a reasonable thing. And that's how I'm trying to rationalize all this, because what you've said is quite devastating in a way. Because it distresses me, and maybe you want to distress me, but it distresses me because I remember growing up. I grew up Orthodox, and my rabbi's son became a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
That was a big deal at the time because most rabbi sons didn't go become doctors, but it was hailed as a good thing because now he's able to do things that help other people in his community. So, I'm torn by this whole thing, but I do think there's, if you're doing something for a reason to have an ultimate goal, like you said, to help others or to do things that help others to help them do other things, that's a good thing. So all these discoveries that we make in science and all this other things, whether they're made by Jews or non-Jews or whatnot, if they benefit society, then that's okay. And then I can see picking up the National Geographic or going to medical school or going to, well, maybe not law school, but going to law school or something like that. But
Right.
Otherwise, I have an issue. This is a tough thing for me, Rabbi, because I don't sit around and study Torah all day. You realize?
I know. Listen, I think I mentioned in one of the classes a couple weeks ago that really the hardest, what we discover when we study Tanya, is the hardest area of life is the middle ground. All the middle ground of life is the hardest place to live, right? As we mentioned, right? It's easier to study Talmud than it is to eat, because to be able to eat with the right intentions is much harder than to study Talmud.
Right.
The same thing is studying secular. It's really a judgment call every time. So, for example, if I'm reading about different animals in the National Geographic, that may be important. You can make the argument. To understand the Torah, you need to understand the animals, right? You can make sometimes, like I said, as Bruce mentioned, of course, sometimes you need a break, sometimes you need to sharpen your mind. Actually, the previous Rebbe, he was known when he needed a break from Torah study, he would play chess. In other words, Torah study was very mentally exhausting, but he didn't want to just waste his time. He would do something that would give him, sharpen his mind without being, studying Torah. So he would play chess. There's a picture of him playing chess with the Rebbe. We're actually told it wasn't on Tisha B'Av. It was just on a regular day. He needed a break, a healthy break. Studying medicine can be holy. Food, like I said, it's the middle ground. You have to really think about it before and say, why am I doing this? It's a much harder place in life to be.
There's a technical issue here, though, too.
Yeah.
So this stuff is all klippus noga. So by definition, it's elevatable.
Right.
It's not from the
stuff.
Pure klippos. So, while it might be not so simple to figure out how it can be elevated, it can be elevated by its very nature.
Yes, it can. It can. I want to read to you an interesting quote from Maimonides. Maimonides has a lengthy explanation in his book on sanctifying the new month, which we do by the moon. And he goes in detail in the chapters giving the astronomy, right? It's called astronomy. He gives the astronomy. And at the end of it, at the end of the entire section on astronomy, he writes like this. I have it quoted here. He says, he writes that I wrote all of this in my book so that you don't have to go look at the secular books to find the astronomy. Very interesting. And as Maimonides is saying, there is a place to study astronomy. I had to study astronomy, but it's not necessarily everybody's place to study astronomy, right? In other words, if you have a reason to study astronomy and you have a way of using it for God, go ahead, study it. But it's not for everybody. And therefore, Maimonides says, I'm going to write in detail within my book of Jewish law. I'm going to give you the astronomy so you don't have to go look elsewhere for the details that you need to know. And that's a very important point, is yes, we all need to know certain amounts of secular study. You know, obviously, many of us, we need to know English, we need to know math. There are many things that we need to know. Then, if you want to go into the deeper study of these things, you have to understand, is there a reason I need to know this stuff or not? Listen, I would argue any doctor should be reading as much medical research as they can, right? If it's, you know, that's important. That's important to their craft. An actuary has to study all those, all of those things. Although generally most of us are not allowed to study other religions, certain people who deal with that are allowed to, it says even
but Rabbi,
Yeah.
the study of other religions,
Yes.
I have an issue with that not being allowed, because to help understand the people you deal with on a day, we don't deal just with Jewish people every day. We deal with Christians, we deal with Catholics, we deal with Muslims, we deal with Buddhists. And we, in order to deal with them in a way, especially as a physician, for instance, we have to understand where they're coming from. There's a whole push in the world today about cultural competency. And this is something that is very much almost against what I'm hearing here. And I don't want to say concerned, but I'm going to say in my life, it's important.
So let me explain.
Maybe I'm speaking heretically, and I'm sorry for that, but that's who I am.
So let me explain. Yes, today you may need, let's say, a crash course or something. But for example, a Jew generally should not be reading the Quran or the New Testament. You can go to someone else who's studied it and can give you a course on the important points that you need to know. You can, and maybe you should listen to those things, but to actually go ahead and start reading their books, you can read selected verses, necessary, whatever, but to go ahead and start reading just for the sake of comparative and understanding and getting deep into it, that's not for everybody, certain individuals do have to do it. Like I was going to mention a moment ago, the Beis Din, the high court itself, had to study all the different religions. They needed it, and they were rabbinics to understand other religions and what's forbidden, what's not. There were many people, certain people came to the Rabbi. The Rabbi told them they should study, the New Testament to be able to help Jews get out of the cults and whatnot. But on a whole, we should not be studying their texts. Should you understand generally their beliefs? Yeah, that's okay. That could be helpful. So for example, I've never studied the New Testament. I've never studied the Quran. I've listened, different people explain different parts. Maybe I should take some more crash courses, but it's not for us generally to study those in depth unless there's a real good reason. And just to understand the cultural things, for that, a crash course, I believe, generally is enough.
Assuming that the person who gives you the crash course is unbiased.
Well,
this is what I mean when you rely on others sometimes to teach you things.
But if you study it, you're also biased. But studying other religious texts is clearly forbidden. Unless that's even more, but National Geographic is a different level than studying other texts. Again, it's permitted for certain people. You know, it'd be probably if you know, obviously we have a professor of religion, you know, it's a different story. You know, right? There are different many rabbis who study the text, you know, necessary. Yeah, exactly. Listen to Tovia Singer. You know, for example, I listen to Tovia Singer. When he quotes those verses, that's fine. So now I know the verses, you know, but I'm not going to pick up their book and start reading it. It has, based on what the Tanya is saying, can contaminate your mind. So what have I presented you today? I said it's going to be a difficult discussion. What we presented today is that the middle ground applies in intellectual study as well, just as it applies in food, and it applies in clothing, it applies in house, and it applies in exercise, and it applies in every other area of life. The middle ground applies in intellectual study. It is a difficult thing, and it's very hard, and a lot of people don't know it about Judaism, because like I said, I started off, I said most people believe that it's intellectual study. That's the greatest thing a human being can do. No. Everything in our lives has to connect us with God. And so we always have to make sure that whatever we're studying has to connect us to God in some way. And you have to make that evaluation. Thank you all for coming. It is 1 o'clock. I'll be open here for questions. For those who want to discuss it further, it is a heavy topic and requires a lot more to think about. And I'll welcome any questions people have, and you can also message me privately. I haven't given you an evaluation tool. I think you can start evaluating it yourself, and if you want, we can discuss. But like I said, understanding there's the middle ground in every area of life and intellectual study as well, and we have to make sure that our intellectual study does not that our intellectual study is also to connect to God. That's really the most important part.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes, a call up, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think I have a
By the
head.
way, just so you know, as I always say, don't think I'm like Mr. Righteous over here and I never do anything wrong. I'm taking
No
you have
one
to
is
know
like
you have
that.
to know the truth, and then we work towards it. You know, if the truth were, if the bar was very low, you know, we'd all reach it really quick. The bar is very high. Lifetime of work.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.